The fluorescent lights hummed their electric hymn above Margaret Walsh's head as she clocked in at 5:24 a.m., the time code glowing on the antiquated system that Sacred Heart had refused to upgrade for 14 years. She'd memorized that routine, the badge swipe, the soft beep, the walk through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and salt air bleeding through the old brick windows, so completely that her body moved through it without requiring permission from her mind. 20 years of invisibility perfected. That's what the morning shift had become. A geometry of movement that left no trace, registered no presence, demanded nothing from the world except the space to work. Her fingers found the patch before she stepped into the ICU. The faded Delta Force unit patch, sewn inside her scrub jacket lining, rough against her fingertips like a talisman. She touched it the same way each morning, a ritual older than her civilian name. Muscle memory from another life. The kind of life where people called you by rank instead of assuming you were background noise. Where your hands meant something beyond the gratitude of patients you'd never see again. The ICU at Sacred Heart was a landscape of beeping monitors and the soft wheeze of ventilators, a symphony she'd learned to move through like a dancer following choreography written in vital signs and drip rates. 12 beds arranged in a semicircle, nurses stationed at the hub, and at this hour, 5:52 a.m., the night shift was already spiraling toward exhaustion while the day crew hadn't yet metabolized their first coffee. Margaret moved to the supply cart and began her rounds with the precision of someone who'd done this exact sequence 10,000 times before. Checking the crash cart. Verifying the medication lock on the 4 lines. Her movements carried the terrifying fluid efficiency of a person who'd learned her craft in places where mistakes didn't result in complaints to administration, they resulted in body bags. The limp was barely noticeable. Most people didn't catch it unless they watched her climb stairs. Shrapnel from Sangin Valley, embedded in her left femur 14 years ago, the fragment too close to the nerve bundle to remove without risking permanent paralysis. The Army's final gift before they'd erased her from all official records and told her to vanish. So she'd vanished. Into a hospital. Into Savannah. Into a name that wasn't hers and a life that asked nothing except that she save people and keep her mouth shut about who she'd been before. Margaret was adjusting the blood pressure cuff on a post-surgical patient when the intercom crackled to life, code blue, trauma bay 4. The words arrived like muscle relaxant in the veins. Everyone froze. 3 nurses in the ICU proper, 1 in the medication room, another doing post-op checks. Margaret finished securing the cuff with her left hand while her right was already moving toward the supply cart. She didn't run. Running looked panicked. She walked with the economy of motion that came from knowing the layout of 12 different field hospitals, knowing exactly where everything was supposed to be and how fast a body could move without appearing to rush. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to happen. Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds at 6:27 a.m., 17 minutes after the code blue had been called and 12 minutes after Margaret and a second-year resident named Kowalski had cracked open a patient's chest at the bedside because the EKG showed VFib and the defibrillator couldn't compete with what looked like a massive pulmonary embolism. The crash cart stood like a skeleton beside the bed, medication scattered across the stainless steel surface in a pattern that would look like chaos to most people and looked like evidence of competence to anyone who understood the language. Dr. Sterling's shoes, Italian leather, probably $2,000, probably polished every morning by someone paid to make him feel important, clicked against the linoleum with the precision of a metronome as he moved through the ICU. He was tall in the way men became tall when they grew up knowing their father's name opened doors. His jawline could cut glass, the kind of handsome that came from generations of selective breeding and dermatologists who answered their phones at midnight. He wore his stethoscope like a crown. Margaret stepped back into the shadow of the medication cart as he passed her station. The motion was so automatic, so entirely muscle memory, that it looked like she was making room for him rather than removing herself from existence. The other nurses straightened. Smiled. Performed. Jennifer from Nights grabbed her report sheets and walked toward him with the posture of someone auditioning for approval. Kowalski, the young resident who'd been elbow-deep in the code blue patient beside Margaret, started walking him through the case with the breathless energy of someone trying to impress a celebrity. Margaret became invisible. The way water becomes invisible when it sits still. The way air becomes invisible when nobody's moving through it. She didn't raise her eyes. Didn't speak. Didn't exist in any way that required acknowledgement. She'd learned this 20 years ago on a base in Helmand province, learned it again in 2 different field hospitals, learned it one more time in the aftermath of an extraction in Sangin that had gone sideways and killed 6 people who weren't supposed to die. The way to survive around men who held power was to let them believe they held it exclusively. To become the wall they looked past. To exist in the spaces where important people's eyes didn't land. Dr. Sterling's gaze passed over her dismissively, scanning the medication cart, registering her presence the way a general registers an orderly, background logistics, necessary but not relevant. His attention was already shifting toward Kowalski's breathless explanation of the code blue, the way the young resident's voice climbed half an octave with the desperation of wanting to prove something. And then Dr. Sterling's eyes stopped. Reconsidered. His gaze swung back toward Margaret's hands, toward the medication line she was verifying with movements so precise they looked like sign language. She was checking the compatibility of a new drug against what was already running, comparing labels with a methodical attention to detail that separated competence from luck. He didn't move. Didn't speak. But something shifted in his face, the kind of subtle recalibration that happened when a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room encountered evidence that someone else might be better at something specific. It lasted 3 seconds. 4. Then he looked away and continued toward the next bed, but Margaret felt the weight of that attention the way a prey animal feels the attention of a predator that hasn't yet decided whether to hunt. She was too competent, and that made her interesting in all the wrong ways. She was too quiet, and quiet people who knew what they were doing were threats to men like Sterling who relied on the noise they made to fill the spaces where actual knowledge should have been. The morning continued with the grinding precision of hospital work. Margaret moved between beds, checking vital signs with hands that never trembled, adjusting drip rates with the certainty of someone who understood that 0.03 of a milliliter could be the difference between healing and harm. The code blue patient had stabilized, sinus rhythm holding, blood pressure climbing back into viable territory, the kind of narrow escape that made everyone feel like they'd done something. Kowalski was checking the chart with the dazed expression of someone whose adrenaline was finally wearing off. The other nurses were already moving on to the next task, the next patient, the next crisis that waited in the ICU's perpetual present tense. Margaret finished her shift notes by 2:15 p.m., documentation entered with the precision of someone who understood that the chart wasn't a record for doctors, it was a defense. She'd learned that in a court-martial hearing she'd never actually attended, testimony she'd never given, a record that officially didn't exist. The military took care of its own by making sure nobody could prove they'd ever existed at all. She picked up her son at St. Vincent's Academy at 3:33 p.m., watching him walk across the parking lot with the loose-limbed ease of a 14-year-old who didn't yet understand that grace disappeared the moment you tried to hold on to it. His name was Marcus. He had her eyes and his father's height, a combination that made him look vaguely like someone else's child, which was the point. The father had been a Navy pilot, dead for years in a training accident that the military had classified in a way that meant she'd never seen the actual report. They'd given her a folded flag and a pension that was just generous enough to raise a child on, and they'd told her not to ask questions about how he died or when or why. Dinner was chicken with rice, nothing that required conversation. Marcus set the table while Margaret moved between the stove and the refrigerator with the automatic precision of muscle memory, each motion measured and efficient. They sat across from each other in the small kitchen of their small house, a 1,200-square-foot Victorian with peeling paint that she kept meaning to fix and never had enough energy to attempt. "How was work?" Marcus asked, the way he always did, the ritual question that required a ritual answer. "Busy," Margaret said. Her voice sounded like it came from someone else's throat. "Code blue this morning." "What happened?" "Patient survived." Marcus pushed rice around his plate with the focus of someone working through a problem that had nothing to do with rice. "Did you like it?" "The code." Margaret looked at her son across the table and saw the question he was actually asking. Did she like the part where she was necessary? Did she like the part where her hands meant something? Did she like the part where she became someone other than the woman who walked to Sacred Heart 5 days a week and came home so exhausted she couldn't speak? "It's what I'm trained for," she said finally. One of those sentences that wasn't an answer, just a statement of fact. Her hands on the fork, steady, unmarked by visible scar tissue, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced staying invisible for so long it had become her natural state. The rest of dinner happened in silence. Marcus cleared the dishes. Margaret moved to the living room and sat on the couch with a book she wasn't reading, her fingers sometimes touching the edge of her sleeve where the jacket with the patch hung in the closet of the bedroom she'd decorated to look like a woman who'd never been anything other than a nurse. The evening moved toward night. Somewhere in the city, Dr. Sterling was probably having dinner at a restaurant where the wine cost more than her weekly paycheck. He was probably speaking to people who listened to every word, nodded at every sentence, treated his opinions like they'd been carved from stone by the hands of gods. He had no idea that the quiet woman who'd verified medications in the shadow of the crash cart had held lives together with her hands in places where the sky caught fire. He had no idea that she'd carried people across desert valleys on her shoulders. He had no idea that she'd buried 6 bodies because someone's intelligence had been wrong and she was the only one left to dig. She was the kind of threat that important men never saw coming, precisely because they were too busy looking at people who looked back at them. And she was about to become much more interesting to Dr. Sterling than he could possibly imagine. Colonel James Reeves arrived at Sacred Heart ICU at 11:38 p.m. on a Tuesday, unconscious from a training accident at Hunter Army Airfield, his vital signs stable enough to fool the monitors but his chart thick with the kind of trauma that didn't always announce itself until the bleeding started again. The trauma surgeons had patched what they could see. The ICU would watch for what they couldn't. Margaret Walsh was checking the ventilator settings when she saw it, the scar. 6 inches long, white and precise, tracking from the angle of his jaw toward his collarbone. The exact pattern. The exact shape. The exact consequence of shrapnel from a marketplace explosion in Sangin 20 years ago when this man had been 6 years old and buried under a wall of concrete, and she had pulled him from the rubble with hands that were much younger then, much steadier, much less burdened by the weight of everything she was not supposed to remember. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She stood there in the semi-dark of the ICU bay, the ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm, the monitors casting their soft glow across his unconscious face, and for the first time in 2 decades, Margaret Walsh let someone see her flinch, but only internally, only in the space between her ribs where her heart had just stopped and restarted in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. His chart said Colonel James Reeves, 47, decorated Delta Force operator, emergency contact listed as Rebecca Reeves, wife, with a notation that his 17-year-old daughter Emma was listed as secondary. No mention of a marketplace. No mention of Afghanistan. No mention of a boy who'd been screaming in the rubble while his mother's blue scarf lay abandoned in the dust 3 meters away. Margaret checked the monitor one more time, pulse steady at 68, oxygen saturation at 98% on the ventilator, blood pressure holding at 112/71, and then she sat down in the chair beside his bed because standing was no longer an option her legs understood. The night shift was quiet. Most of the other nurses were in the break room or attending to patients further down the ICU corridor. Margaret had the colonel alone, which was the only mercy she could imagine God offering in this moment. She reached over and adjusted the 4 drip rate, her hands moving through the motion like they had 1,000 times before with 1,000 other patients, muscle memory that had nothing to do with the electricity running through her chest. She stood again. Sat again. Her breath came shallow and fast, and she forced it down, controlled it, made it steady the way she had learned to control her breathing in other places, in other lives, when control was the difference between coming home and not coming home. At 2:33 a.m., during her rounds, Margaret returned to his bedside to check the Foley catheter output and the peripheral foresight. The ICU was at its quietest hour, the fluorescent panels above her head buzzing their endless mechanical song, the monitors their soft electronic chorus, nothing else moving except the rise and fall of his chest with the ventilator's rhythm. She leaned in to adjust his pillowcase, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the words coming out before she could stop them, "I remember you. The marketplace. Your mother's blue scarf." The words hung in the dark, dangerous, true. I got you out. You were screaming. I remember your voice. She straightened the blanket, her hand steady now, purpose replacing panic. You're going to be okay, Colonel. You've survived worse. I know you have. She didn't see Dr. Sterling standing in the doorway until she turned to leave, his frame silhouetted against the hallway lights, his face unreadable. Morning rounds came at 9:15 a.m. sharp, which meant Dr. Sterling arrived at 9:14 with his white coat pressed into submission and his smile calibrated precisely at the angle that made most people trust him. Margaret had learned not to be most people. She stood at the foot of Colonel Reeves' bed with his chart, ready with his vitals, his current medications, propofol for sedation, cisatracurium for paralysis, fentanyl for pain, his ventilator settings, his latest labs, all of it filed away in the part of her mind that never forgot numbers or details or the way a patient's pupils responded to light. The Colonel's wife, Rebecca, stood to his left, her hand resting on the bed rail. His daughter Emma stood beside her mother, still in her school uniform from yesterday because this was yesterday to them, the accident only 16 hours ago, the shock still fresh enough to make everything feel unreal. Dr. Sterling stopped at the foot of the bed. He didn't look at the monitors. He didn't look at the 4 lines or the ventilator or any of the machinery keeping the Colonel alive. He looked at Margaret, and his smile widened just enough to show his teeth. Nurse Walsh, he said, his voice like honey poured over glass, perhaps you can explain your inappropriate emotional attachment to this patient? I overheard your whispered confidences at his bedside during the night shift. Very unprofessional. The room temperature dropped. Rebecca's hand froze on the bed rail. Emma's eyes went wide, searching Margaret's face for explanation. Margaret took one measured breath. Her voice came out calm and flat and professional. I was ensuring patient comfort, Doctor. Colonel Reeves' vital signs were elevated. I was monitoring his response to sedation. Of course, Sterling said, his smile never wavering. Though most nurses manage that without the intimate bedside confessions. Tell me, do you do this with all our military patients? The special attention? The emotional investment? He turned slightly, addressing the Colonel's wife now, his sympathy theatrical and perfect. Mrs. Reeves, I want to assure you that we maintain the highest professional standards here at Sacred Heart. Some staff members, unfortunately, develop what we call transference. They project emotions onto patients, particularly high-profile ones. It's quite common, actually. Very unprofessional. Very inappropriate. He looked back at Margaret, his eyes cold. Florence Nightingale here seems to think she's special. That military patients need something more than professional medical care. What they actually need is competence, not groupies. Margaret felt the heat then, the blood rising in her neck, the trembling that wanted to start in her hands. She stopped it. She locked it down. She had survived interrogations. She had survived wounds. She had survived the kind of fear that made ordinary fear look like a shadow. She could survive this. One tear escaped, just one, precise and controlled, the kind of tear that looked like it was born from hurt rather than rage. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her jaw steady, her shoulders back. Sir, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, I've been written up by better men than you, and they had the courage to do it in private. The room went dead silent. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. Rebecca's eyes widened. Dr. Sterling's face flushed red, not anger, Margaret saw with perfect clarity, but embarrassment, the particular shade of humiliation that came from being corrected by someone beneath you. He turned away without responding, already moving to the next bed, already moving past her, already beginning the process of deciding how Margaret Walsh would pay for those 11 words. The lunch break room at noon was where the real message arrived. Margaret entered at 12:07 p.m. with her salad in a plastic container and her yogurt and her banana, the same lunch she brought every Tuesday because routines were survival tools and breaking routine was weakness. The break room was crowded, 7 other nurses, the resident from night still here for some reason, one of the phlebotomists. Margaret sat down at her corner table, the one she always sat at, and opened her salad. Within 30 seconds, the break room became a choreography of abandonment. Chairs scraped. Conversations died mid-sentence. One nurse stood abruptly, "Oh, I forgot to check on Mrs. Chen in 4. Another, "I need to call pharmacy about that antibiotic." A third simply stood and walked out without explanation. The phlebotomist looked at her, hesitated for a single moment, a flash of something like apology in her eyes, and then she stood too and left. Within 2 minutes, the break room was empty except for Margaret, her salad, and the sound of her fork against plastic. She ate methodically. Lettuce. Tomato. One crouton at a time. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge what had happened. She simply ate, because eating was also a survival tool, and surviving this required being functional. The taste of the salad was nothing. Everything tasted like nothing now. The unit board was posted at 1:43 p.m., right by the nurses' station where everyone passed multiple times during their shift. The notice was printed on hospital letterhead, Dr. Sterling's signature at the bottom in his precise, controlled handwriting. The formal write-up cited unprofessional conduct and possible HIPAA violations regarding inappropriate patient boundaries. It noted the emotional exchange at Colonel Reeves' bedside in flagrant disregard for professional standards. It recommended immediate investigation and potential disciplinary action. Margaret found Dr. Sterling standing nearby when she read it, chatting casually with one of the attending physicians, his body language relaxed, his tone conversational. But his eyes were on Margaret, watching her read the words, watching her jaw tighten, watching her take one breath and then another. "Just so we're all clear on professional standards," he said, loud enough for the entire station to hear, loud enough for it to register as a moment, an announcement, a public declaration. He was still looking at Margaret when he said it. She reached down and touched the edge of her jacket, the inside seam where the unit patch was sewn, the tiny Delta Force insignia hidden where only she would ever see it. The fabric was soft now, worn, faded. She traced it with one finger while Dr. Sterling watched, and then she turned and walked away, her back straight, her composure intact, her silence more devastating than any word she could have spoken. What Dr. Sterling didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he stood there satisfied with his victory, as he turned back to his conversation with the attending physician, as he mentally catalogued the ways he had successfully removed a problem from his orbit, was that his strategic thinking had only just begun. The phone calls were already forming in his mind. The network he had built over 15 years at Sacred Heart was about to receive activation orders. And Margaret Walsh, the invisible nurse who had made the mistake of becoming visible, was about to find out exactly what it cost to threaten a man like Dr. Sterling when you had no institutional power to defend yourself. But that wasn't the worst part. The alarms came at 2 in the morning like artillery fire, 3 separate monitors screaming at frequencies that made the surgical wing jolt awake. Blood pressure 72/40. Heart rate 120, climbing. Oxygen saturation 91 and falling. Colonel James Reeves' eyes were still closed, his muscular frame gone slack against the ICU mattress, and the cardiac monitor showed something Margaret had seen before in field hospitals where the lights went out and mortars fell, the unmistakable pattern of a heart trying to beat inside its own prison. His chest was filling with blood. Dr. Chen stood frozen at the bedside, the ultrasound probe trembling in his hands like he was holding something alive that might bite. His face had the particular shade of white that meant panic was winning, that the gap between what he'd watched a senior resident do and what his own hands could actually accomplish had just opened like a chasm. He stared at the screen showing fluid accumulation around the heart's left ventricle, thick black space where there should be only millimeters, and his voice came out small. "I've never done a pericardiocentesis. Only watched one. I don't." The monitor beeped again, that particular rhythm that meant the beat was weakening, compensating, drowning. Around him, nurses moved in controlled chaos, checking lines, drawing blood, but no one had the authority to make the decision that would save Colonel Reeves' life in the next 3 minutes. Maybe less. Margaret knew the math. Blood pressing on the outside of the heart meant the chambers couldn't fill. No fill, no output. The body couldn't lie about numbers, and the numbers were screaming that they were running out of time. She moved toward the door of the patient room, her legs remembering the particular walk of someone trained to move fast without drawing attention, when Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the alarm noise like a scalpel. "You're not assigned to this patient anymore, Walsh. I've reassigned you to the surgical wing effective immediately." He was standing at the crash cart, blocking the path between Margaret and the emergency equipment, his posture carrying the confidence of a man who'd already won this particular game in his head. "Dr. Chen will handle this. You're done here." Margaret stood still for exactly 1 second. The monitor showed heart rate down to 88. The resident's hands were shaking harder now. Colonel Reeves' wife stood in the corner beside their daughter, her knuckles white where she gripped the railing, watching her husband's chest move in that irregular pattern that meant the body was starting to fail. Sterling's voice continued, smoother now, certain. "I said you're reassigned. And frankly, a pericardiocentesis is above your licensure anyway. Dr. Chen is the physician here. We'll wait for the attending." The attending was 20 minutes away. Margaret did the calculation automatically, the kind of mental math that gets taught in combat medicine courses and refined in places where you don't have the luxury of waiting for backup. Blood loss at this rate, and the ultrasound showed significant accumulation, meant cardiac arrest inside 3 minutes. 2, if the bleeding was active rather than seeping. The attending would arrive to a body already cooling, to a family already broken, to a man who'd made it through multiple combat tours only to suffocate inside his own ribcage in a well-lit ICU in Savannah, Georgia because protocol mattered more than pulse. Margaret's hand moved to her jacket without conscious thought, fingers finding the place where the faded Delta Force patch was sewn inside the lining, that small piece of cloth that held 20 years of things she wasn't supposed to remember anymore. Her voice came out low and even, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that the world could do. "Doctor, his cardiac output is failing. He'll arrest in 90 seconds. She wasn't asking permission anymore. Something had shifted in her posture, in the way she stood, in the frequency of her voice. It had dropped an octave, losing the careful deference that had protected her for 2 decades. "I can get a needle in his chest before that happens. Or we can wait and explain to his family why we watched him die." Sterling's face tightened, color rising in his cheeks. "I'm warning you, Walsh. You walk into that room and perform a procedure above your licensure, and I will file termination papers before the sun comes up. Security will escort you out by breakfast. Is that clear?" The threat was real. The power behind it was real. He had the institutional authority to make her vanish by noon, and they both knew it. She'd be gone, she'd be blacklisted. Her 20 years at Sacred Heart would become a gap in her professional history that no hospital would touch. The monitor beeped 3 times in rapid succession, 70 beats per minute now, the rhythm deteriorating into something that looked more like gasping than beating. Margaret stepped around Dr. Sterling like he was furniture. Her limp was more pronounced when she moved fast, her left knee never quite straightening, the legacy of a mortar round in Helmand Province that she'd never reported because reporting injuries meant being pulled from duty, and duty had meant everything back then. Now it meant a man with a daughter who looked about 17, who was watching her father's heart fail. She began prepping the pericardiocentesis kit with hands that had performed this procedure in a bombed-out clinic near Sangin where the electricity came from a generator someone had salvaged from a downed Apache, where the surgical light was a headlamp and the anesthesia was whatever merciful unconsciousness the body offered. Her hands remembered the feeling of advancing a needle through skin and fascia and pericardium, the particular resistance and release that meant you'd breached the membrane surrounding the heart without perforating the organ itself. Her hands remembered far worse conditions than this, the fluorescent lights overhead, the cardiac monitor with its digital precision, the 4 lines already running with warm saline. In Sangin, she would have been grateful for these luxuries. She swabbed the chest wall with chlorhexidine, the antiseptic smell sharp and familiar, and Dr. Chen stepped back from the bedside like he was surrendering command, which was the only smart thing he'd done since the alarms had started screaming. Sterling remained where he was, watching like he thought sheer observation might stop her from doing this, might enforce his authority through will alone. The resident's voice came out small. His pressure's 52/30. "Margaret." She was already moving. The needle was 14 gauge, metal catching the overhead light, and she entered the chest wall at the 5th intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process, the angle practiced until muscle memory could do it without thinking. Her eyes were on the monitor, watching the needle advance, feeling through the needle for that moment when tissue resistance changed, when she was no longer pressing against muscle but instead against the fibrous sac that surrounded a failing heart. The sensation came, that particular give, that release, and she drew back on the syringe plunger. Fluid came. Dark. The color of old blood. It filled the syringe in a rush, and the moment the pressure released from around the heart chambers, the monitor showed it immediately, the rhythm strengthened, the beat deepened, oxygen saturation climbing like it had been waiting for permission. 94. 96. The numbers on the screen started moving in the direction that meant life was winning. Margaret drew another 40 milliliters, then another 20, her hand steady as a surgical laser, the tremor that never came even though she'd just violated institutional protocol and her career in the same breath. Colonel Reeves' color was returning. His blood pressure climbed, 70/40, then 80, then 90, and his breathing deepened, his body recognizing that the crushing pressure was gone, that oxygen could move again. His eyes fluttered, consciousness beginning to surface from whatever chemical twilight they'd kept him in, and the first thing he saw when his vision cleared was Margaret Walsh standing over his chest with a syringe full of blood that should have killed him. She looked back once at Dr. Sterling, who had gone very still, very pale, his mouth open like he was going to say something and then choosing not to. The moment between them lasted exactly as long as it took for Colonel Reeves' oxygen saturation to hit 98, for his heart rate to settle into a rhythm that looked like strength again, for his wife to make a sound somewhere between a sob and a prayer. Margaret set the syringe down with the same precision she'd used to insert the needle. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm as still water. Pressure stable. Sats 98. I need to start continuous cardiac monitoring for reaccumulation. She wasn't asking Sterling for permission anymore. She wasn't asking anyone. She was giving the orders now, stating facts the way a senior officer states orders, and the room moved around her like water around stone. The nurse began documenting. Dr. Chen began making phone calls. The machine settled into the quiet rhythm of a body that was going to make it through the night. Sterling left without another word, his exit less like a tactical retreat and more like a man who'd just realized he was standing in a room with someone he didn't actually understand, someone whose competence had just revealed itself as something far deeper than protocol and procedure. He didn't know yet. But he would find out soon enough, and when he did, the calculations would shift entirely. He'd escalated his campaign against a woman he thought was defenseless, and she'd just demonstrated that she could save a life in front of 3 witnesses without breaking a sweat. That wasn't the worst part for Dr. Sterling. The worst part was that she'd done it in front of his superiors. Dr. Sterling arrived at the bedside exactly 17 minutes after the alarm went off. Margaret's hands moved on their own, muscle memory from field hospitals where the lights failed and the mortars fell close enough to shake the walls. The needle advanced through the pericardial sac with the kind of precision that only came from having done this in a marketplace in Sangin while buildings collapsed around her and a 6-year-old boy was drowning in his own blood. She withdrew 200 cubic centimeters of fluid, dark, blood-tinged, the pressure that had been crushing Colonel Reeves's heart now draining into the collection syringe. The monitors responded first. The O2 sac climbed, 71, 78, 84. His blood pressure rose from the basement, 60/40 climbing to 88/56. His lips went from gray to pink. The heart monitor showed the electrical rhythm organizing itself, the chaotic pattern settling into something sustainable, sinus rhythm reasserting itself like a man waking from a nightmare. That was incredible, Dr. Chen stammered from the corner where he'd been frozen, finally finding his voice. Dr. Sterling's face transformed. The color drained completely, leaving the kind of whiteness that comes from watching your authority dissolve in real time. He stepped forward, eyes locked on Margaret's hands as she set down the syringe with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. "You just performed a procedure above your licensure," Sterling said, his voice dropping to something that sounded like a tank idling in a garage, present, dangerous, controlled. In direct violation of my explicit order. You're done here. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Margaret wiped her hands on a sterile towel and turned to face him fully. She met his eyes with the kind of stillness that made the fluorescent lights overhead seem to buzz louder in comparison. She said nothing. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Dr. Sterling pulled his phone from his pocket and was dialing before he reached the door. The first call went to Thomas Brennan, the hospital board chair, 3:24 a.m., early enough that it felt like an emergency. Sterling's voice was measured, almost conversational, laying out the violation like a chess move. A nurse performed a cardiac procedure with no authorization. We're talking about liability exposure here, Thomas. Gross negligence. I documented it. By 4:15 a.m., 2 more calls had followed, to board members Castellano and Hughes, both planted with the same seed: unprofessional conduct, possible safety concerns, a nurse operating outside her scope. By 5:44 a.m., Sterling sat in his office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, Margaret's personnel file open on his desk. He began making other calls, her references listed in the system. The number for her previous employer in Baltimore connected to someone who said they had no record of her employment. The Georgia Nurses Association had a gap in her licensure history from 1997 to 2009. Nothing, he said, but everything was there for him to find if someone looked carefully enough. That's when Sterling understood. The military background checks had come back blank, not unavailable, but systematically redacted. Entire years missing from her record. The kind of absence that only happened when someone had been ordered to disappear. When an extraction went sideways in a place like Sangin and the Pentagon decided you never officially existed at all. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had been erased from every database the day she was pulled out, her entire history classified, sealed, buried under layers of black ops protocols that meant no civilian HR department would ever be able to verify anything about her past. Sterling smiled then. A slow, deliberate smile. Because now he had leverage that went deeper than a single procedure violation. Now he had mystery. Gaps that looked like fraud. A personnel file with references that didn't exist, an employment history that couldn't be verified. Now he could frame this as a liability issue that went to her very foundation as a professional. At 6:45 a.m., he submitted the formal investigation request to the State Nursing Board. 40 pages. Detailed. Professional. Citing the unauthorized procedure, yes, but also flagging significant discrepancies in employment verification, unverifiable professional history, suspicious gaps in licensure documentation, and unexplained military record inconsistencies. Each line was a piece of a larger narrative. This woman was hiding something. By 8:36 a.m., Sterling had Margaret's hospital personnel file reconstructed with surgical precision. He added dated entries for violations he invented, citations from 2011 for insubordination toward attending physician, an incident from 2015 involving questionable medication administration accuracy, a 2018 note about inappropriate familiarity with patients. All fabricated. All dated. All crafted to look like a pattern. Margaret was called to HR at 10:55 a.m. She sat in the waiting room in her civilian clothes, the unit patch she'd kept sewn into her scrub jacket's lining now folded in a clear plastic bag in her purse, and waited for them to tell her something she already knew was coming. The HR director read from Sterling's documentation without making eye contact. Based on gross violation of scope of practice, unauthorized procedures, and significant concerns about your employment history, we have made the decision to terminate your employment effective immediately. The words came out rehearsed, scripted, the kind of delivery that meant Sterling had already had someone draft the language. We've provided you with information about COBRA coverage and your 401k options. Security escorted her to her car by noon. She walked past the nurses' station where colleagues she'd known for 20 years suddenly became very busy. She surrendered her badge and parking pass at the front desk while Sterling watched from the administrative wing hallway, arms crossed, face carved from stone. By 3:53 p.m., Margaret sat at her kitchen table in a house she'd rented in Midtown Savannah, still wearing the same civilian clothes, still in the same chair. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. Her hands rested on the table, flat and still, the kind of stillness that comes from muscle memory, from standing watch in darkness, from waiting for orders that might never come, from the particular discipline of people trained to survive in the gaps between catastrophes. She was crying, but not the kind of crying that made sound. No sobs. No trembling. Just tears that traced down her face in parallel lines while she stared at nothing, at the space where her career used to be, at the second time in her life that she'd lost everything because someone had decided she wasn't allowed to exist. The first time was in 2007. The extraction from Sangin had gone sideways. She didn't think about the details anymore, but her left leg still carried the shrapnel from the IED that had detonated 3 meters from her position as she was carrying Colonel Reeves out. The Pentagon's debrief was clinical. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh's involvement in the operation would be classified retroactively. She would be ordered to disappear. New identity. New city. New life. The military erased her so thoroughly that sometimes she had to check her own hands to confirm she'd ever existed at all. And now she'd surfaced to save a life, and Dr. Jonathan Sterling had erased her all over again. Jackson found her at 5:15 p.m. when he came home from school, backpack slung over one shoulder, and stopped dead in the doorway. His mother at the kitchen table. The same coffee cup. The same stillness. The same tears that weren't making sound. Mom. His voice cracked. 14 years old and already learning what it meant to watch the strongest person he knew break without breaking. Why are you home early? Margaret looked at her son and couldn't find the words to explain how you lose everything twice in one lifetime. How you could survive extraction and shrapnel and classification and disappearance and build a new life in a hospital where nobody asked your name. How you could be invisible for 20 years and then save a man's life and still lose everything because someone decided your existence was a liability. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Jackson set down his backpack slowly, still watching her face. He'd seen her handle trauma. He'd seen her handle pain. But he'd never seen her handle this, and something shifted in him the way it shifts in people who understand that they have to be the strong one now. He walked to his room without another word and opened the storage box in his closet, the wooden box his grandfather had given her, the one she kept locked in the back of her closet and thought nobody knew about. He knew. He carried the box back to the kitchen and set it on the table beside the cold coffee. Margaret's hand moved toward it, but Jackson shook his head. He opened it himself, revealing the medals stacked in precise order. 2 silver stars, their ribbon bright despite the years. A bronze star with a V device for Valor, the decoration only earned in combat. A purple heart. At the bottom, dog tags and a deactivated military ID card with the rank clearly printed, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Margaret Walsh, Navy SEALs Command, retired. Mom, Jackson said, his voice steady in a way that made him sound older than 14. They need to see these. Margaret stared at her son and at the medals that represented the 22 years she'd spent in a war the world didn't talk about. She saw his determination and understood, in that moment, that sometimes you don't choose when your history stops being a secret. Sometimes your child chooses for you. 3 days. That's all it took for the hospital board to schedule Margaret's termination hearing. 3 days of silence in her kitchen while her son Jackson watched her stare at cold coffee. 3 days of knowing the official story, unprofessional conduct, procedure violation, HIPAA breach, was already written into the institutional memory of Sacred Heart like gospel. The hospital had decided who she was. Now they would make it official. The executive conference room on the 4th floor smelled like leather chairs and old money. Mahogany tables stretched the length of a basketball court. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Savannah's historic district, moss hanging from oaks like the remnants of better times. The board chair sat at the head with Margaret's personnel file open in front of him, the pages already yellowed with premature age. 5 other members flanked him on either side. Their expressions suggested they'd already decided. Their mouths were just formalities. Dr. Sterling sat at the opposite end of the table from Margaret, his Italian loafers polished to a mirror shine, his tie a shade of burgundy that screamed private school endowment. He looked like a man who'd never stood in a bathroom at 3 in the morning holding his own child because the hospitals were full and the antibiotics cost more than his mortgage. He looked like a man who'd always won. His briefcase sat beside him, leather, expensive, the kind that holds documents the way other men hold prayers. "The documentation is clear," he said, his voice moving through the room like a prosecutor who'd already convicted someone in absentia. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh," he paused, letting the title hang like an accusation, exceeded her scope of practice, performed an emergency procedure without physician authorization, and concealed her background with apparent intent to evade standard credentialing. The liability alone. Margaret sat 3 chairs from the end of the table, her hands folded on the surface in front of her. She wore the same scrubs she wore to work. No one had told her to dress differently. She'd come anyway in the clothes of her invisibility, the uniform of a ghost. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She looked at a spot on the wall just above Dr. Sterling's head where the hospital's accreditation placard hung. That was when the conference room doors opened. Her son Jackson stood in the doorway with a wooden box. Mahogany, polished dark as old blood, the kind of box that holds things people fought and bled to earn. His 16-year-old hand shook slightly as he walked to the table, not from fear, but from the weight of what he carried. Not the box itself, which probably weighed 3 pounds. The weight of knowledge. The weight of finally being allowed to speak his mother's name aloud. He placed the box on the polished table and opened it. 2 silver stars caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like lightning. The blue ribbon with white stars gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday, though Margaret had never polished it. She'd let it stay tarnished, let it stay invisible, let it become myth instead of memory. Below them lay a bronze star with a small V device that means with Valor. Below that, a purple heart in its case, the purple silk ribbon catching the light like a wound you could see. The board chair's hand moved toward the medals without permission from his brain. "What is this?" he whispered. The doors opened again. Colonel James Reeves walked into the conference room. His left arm was still in a sling, the physical therapy not yet complete, his movements careful as a man who'd learned that his body was a weapon that could be turned against him. He was thin, hospital thin, recovery thin, but his uniform was pressed, his shoes polished, his rank insignia visible on his shoulders like a declaration. Behind him stood a man in a naval dress uniform, the gold insignia on his collar catching the light. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Halloway. Delta Squadron. Former operator. The kind of man whose presence alone told you that the rules had changed. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Colonel Reeves said. His voice sounded like a gavel. It sounded like a door closing. It sounded like a man who'd spent 6 years forgetting a marketplace explosion and 30 seconds remembering every detail. She saved my life in 2007. She saved my life last week. I've never forgotten either moment. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a world ending and a new one being born in the same breath. The board chair's trembling hands moved back to the personnel file. He lifted it. Pages. Forms. Background checks. All of it fabricated. The handwriting that Dr. Sterling had added to Margaret's records, notation about her concerning emotional attachment, about her pattern of boundary violations, about the blank spaces where her references should have been filled in. One supervisor's recommendation box simply read, "No previous records available." "Where did this come from?" the board chair asked, his voice cracking like old plaster. Senior Chief Halloway stepped forward. He was tall the way mountains are tall, not through bulk but through presence, through the way the air itself seemed to acknowledge him. He looked at each medal one at a time. Silver Star for Action in Helmand Province, 2006. Charlie Platoon Extraction that never officially happened. He paused. Silver Star for the Sangin Operation, 2007. The extraction that went sideways. Every classified operator who came out of that alive owes her. He paused again. The room held its breath. Bronze Star for saving Colonel Reeves when he was 6 years old and shouldn't have survived the day. He lifted the Purple Heart. Shrapnel took her left leg from the knee down 2 inches in Sangin. She kept working. She kept saving lives. She never asked for acknowledgement. The FBI agents came through the door like they'd been waiting for their cue. 2 of them, badges visible, the kind of calm that comes from knowing the law is on your side. The ranking agent, a woman with grey threading through her hair and eyes like concrete, walked directly to Dr. Sterling. Dr. Marcus Sterling. You're under federal investigation for falsifying military records, fabricating personnel documentation, and tampering with official background investigation materials. You have the right to remain silent. Dr. Sterling stood. The mahogany chair scraped backward like a scream. His polished shoes suddenly looked absurd. His burgundy tie looked like blood he was wearing. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice the same voice that had silenced Margaret in the break room, that had forced her to choose between her career and her silence. "I was protecting patient care standards." Her background was not verified. The hospital's liability. The agent didn't slow. The second agent began handcuffing him. Sterling's expensive wrists went into metal that didn't care about his education or his network or the board members he'd called at dawn to orchestrate Margaret's destruction. They walked him out of the conference room. Past the elevators, past the ICU, past the nurses' station where every nurse who'd stood up and left when Margaret sat down for lunch now stood frozen. His polished shoes clicked on the linoleum. Click! 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 A rhythm that said the world was changing. A rhythm that said a man could lose everything in the time it took to walk 30 meters. At the unit board, next to the schedule, next to the patient assignments, the write-up still hung. Unprofessional conduct and possible HIPAA violations. Margaret stood beside it as Sterling passed. She didn't look at him. She looked through him the way you look through glass, acknowledging nothing, reflecting nothing, existing in a space he no longer occupied. He tried to meet her eyes. She turned away. The gesture was a knife and a kindness at the same time. The board chair called for a recess. The military men and the FBI agents waited in the hallway while lawyers were consulted and phones were dialed up the chain of command. When they reconvened, the chair's voice sounded smaller. "The Sacred Heart Board of Directors would like to formally rescind the termination notice," he said, reading from notes written in margins of Margaret's file. "We would like to offer full reinstatement, back pay dating to time of termination, and a settlement of—" "No," Margaret said. The room went still again. "I don't want money I didn't earn. I want my record cleared. I want the write-up removed from the unit board. I want to come back to work." The chair nodded slowly. "That can be arranged." Colonel Reeves spoke. His voice was a story, carefully constructed, each word a brick in a wall that would protect Margaret from what came next. "I was 6 years old in Sangin. I remember a blue scarf my mother wore. I remember the marketplace explosion. I remember hands, steady hands, calm hands, lifting me out of the rubble. I remember a nurse singing to keep me calm while she worked on my wounds. I've thought about that nurse every day for 20 years. I never forgot those hands. I never forgot that voice. Last week, when those same hands saved my life for the second time, I finally knew why." He paused. "The only inappropriate thing in this hospital is that it took my near death for you to see who she really is." The other nurses came later, in ones and twos, offering apologies that Margaret received like a person receiving weather reports, acknowledging them, not fighting them, moving on. She didn't forgive them. Forgiveness was a luxury reserved for people who could afford it. Margaret had spent 20 years learning to afford nothing. She simply returned to work. 2 years passed. Someone spotted Dr. Sterling teaching CPR certification at a community college in South Carolina. Not the main campus. The satellite location, the one that serviced recertifying paramedics and nurses from rural clinics. His office was a converted storage room. The nameplate on the door was small. His students didn't know his name, not really. They knew him as the instructor who'd forgotten how to inspire, who'd learned instead how to simply check boxes and collect a minimum wage paycheck that never quite covered the apartment he rented month to month. Margaret never thought about him at all. She worked at Hunter Army Airfield now, training combat medics in a program she designed from the ground up. A uniform hung in her locker, utilities with her rank insignia restored, the faded unit patch now visible on her shoulder where it belonged. The limp she'd earned in Sangin showed only when the weather changed, when the shrapnel in her leg remembered that it didn't belong there. She stood in front of 30 soldiers, 22 years old, scared, heading toward places the news couldn't reach, and taught them pericardiocentesis with the precision of a woman who'd performed it in markets and in mud and in a well-lit ICU while her entire past hung in the balance. "You'll do this in the dark," she told them, her hands moving through the procedure with the economy of motion that comes from doing something until it becomes prayer. "Under fire. With your hands shaking. But you'll do it. Because someone's counting on you to be steady when everything else is chaos." The class watched her with the focused attention of people learning to live with impossible responsibility. One medic raised his hand. "Senior Chief, how do you stay calm?" Margaret smiled. It was the first time in 20 years anyone had asked her that question and genuinely wanted the answer. "You practice. You breathe. You remember that panic is a luxury someone else can't afford. You be the person who doesn't break." Colonel Reeves visited monthly, bringing his family, his wife and 2 children who listened to their father explain what Margaret had done before they were even born. His daughter was interested in military medicine now, watching Margaret teach with the kind of attention that meant she was seeing possibility instead of limitation. Jackson, Margaret's son, was 16 now, volunteering at the base hospital, wearing an Army Medical Corps volunteer badge, watching his mother teach with pride that filled his chest like a second heartbeat. The day someone asked Margaret about her limp, she touched her leg where the shrapnel still lived, where it would live until the day she died, a reminder written in her body. She smiled, small, private, the kind of smile that comes from having survived twice. Sangin, 2007. Hurts when it rains. Reminds me why I'm here when it doesn't. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. It's the small choices made in silence, the boundaries held when no one's looking, the hands that stay steady when everything else falls apart. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. And some wear both. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or had to prove yourself against impossible odds, please subscribe to this channel. Like this video and comment below, what would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have stayed invisible, or would you have let the truth surface? Thank you for watching. There are more stories coming.